So I'm Helen Ladd. Some people call me Sunny Ladd. I'm a member of CALDER, and I'm delighted to be here. This is a co-authored paper with Mavzuna Taraiva, who's a PhD student at Duke. We're talking about charter schools in a specific state, in the state of North Carolina. I've written with various co-authors about charters in North Carolina quite a bit. We started out with, in 1996, in 1996 with 100 schools. It's been increased. The data we're looking at today, I think there are about 156 charter schools. In fact, in North Carolina, we're up to 200, so it's been growing. Race and racial isolation of students in charter schools has been an issue right from the beginning. And so in this question, we're trying to dig deep and try to figure out, well, why is it that charter schools in North Carolina are so racially unbalanced? Got two specific research questions. One is, do charter school choices increase racial segregation? That's just a descriptive issue that I'll talk about. More complicated is how do choosers' preferences about the racial mix of students and other policy relevant charter school characteristics affect the racial balance of individual charter schools. Notice that we're not paying any attention to the prior decision of switchers to a charter school. So we're not, having them trade off characteristics of public schools, traditional public schools versus charter schools. So we're looking at the choices made by parents who switched a child from a traditional public school, TPS, to a charter school in the 2015-16 school year. And we do separate analyses for switchers into elementary schools and middle schools. And the sample is based only on people who switched their child from a traditional public school to a charter school, not from a charter school to another charter school or a private school to a charter school. We break the analysis down by minorities, which include Blacks, Hispanics, and some other groups. We also do some of the analysis for Blacks alone, which are a subgroup of the minority group. We don't do it for Hispanics because we just don't have big enough samples. And then we do some analysis with a further breakdown by the socioeconomic status of the students, but not for all. So first research question, do the choices of switchers increase racial segregation? There's been a lot of prior research on this in North Carolina and elsewhere. In North Carolina, our general findings from the past have been, yes, the switching to charter schools does increase racial segregation, but that's not true. That's not the same finding as in all cities or states. If you have a very African-American or segregated public school district, you might have charters lead to greater diversity and less segregation. In our examination of this first research question, we're just doing something very simple. This is just descriptive, comparing the racial mix of the traditional public school from which the child leaves to the racial mix of the chosen charter school. And here's the conclusion. It's there in red. Charters increase racial segregation primarily because of the choices of white parents, not minority parents. So I'm just going to show you that. Whoops, here it is, sorry. These are descriptive results for elementary schools and middle schools. Start with the left-hand column over there. We've got minority switchers. So that's our group. And down at the bottom, you can see the total number of switchers. So 2,979 minority switchers. On the vertical over there, we can see much higher minority. That means they're moving to a school that has a higher minority share than the traditional public school they came from. Much higher, same share, lower minority, or much lower minority. And what you see, if you look down at the minority switchers, what you see is that some of them moved to lower minority or much higher minority schools. Some of them moved to lower minority schools. It's all over the place. There's no clear pattern in their decisions. If you go to the white switchers for elementary schools, though, you see a very different pattern. Very few of the white switchers, 4.5% plus 10.7%, moved to higher minority schools. But most of the white switchers, as highlighted in red at the bottom, are moving to schools with lower minority shares than the traditional public school they came from. So it's the decisions of the white switchers, not the minority or black switchers, that is leading to increased racial segregation. And down at the bottom, you can see the numbers, and middle school patterns are similar. We've got a somewhat smaller number of switchers into the middle schools. So that's just the first question. Second question is much more complicated to get at. How do the parental preferences of the switchers, it's all switchers, affect the racial mix of individual charter schools? Now, there's a lot of prior work on trying to tease out educational preferences with lots of methods like telephone surveys. I think most economists would agree that looking at revealed preferences is the best way to tease out information on preferences. So what we're going to do in here is to estimate conditional logit models, and I'm not going to write the equations out, but we're going to identify each child's choice set of charter schools. We know what public school the child was in, and we're going to use a 20-mile radius, and that's based on data that we have made sense to do that. So the choice set is all charters within 20 miles of the traditional public school. And then we're assuming that the parent chooses the utility maximizing charter school within the available choice set. Now, and that they end up at the school that is utility maximizing. Now, we know that some of them can't get into that because schools are oversubscribed, but we're hoping that the lottery system of enrollment adds noise but not bias to the estimate. And then we're going to look at the preferences or the schools they choose with a lot of focus on the racial mix of students in the schools, but we're going to include a lot of other characteristics that parents may value. So what is it that parents might value as they're making these decisions? They might value the racial mix of the students in the charter schools, and that's what our main focus is. We're going to measure that by 5 categorical variables, 0 to 20% minority, all the way up to 80 to 100% minority. They may care about the distance to the charter school. We're measuring distance from the school, not from the residents, and that's because of data limitations. We don't know exactly where all these people live. They may care about the academic quality of the charter school. We're going to use just 3 categorical variables, which are percent of students at grade level. We're not using a value-added measure there because parents don't know anything about value-added. What they look at is the rankings of schools A to F, which is based on performance levels. Services provided may differ across the charter schools. In North Carolina, the charter schools are not required to provide transportation, but some of them do in the form of buses. Some of them say, look, we're going to help you organize some form of carpool, or we're not going to do anything. Parents may care about the mission of the charter school, and we've looked at websites of all the charter schools, and we've categorized them into schools that are quite generic or have some sort of innovative philosophy or curriculum or an orientation specifically to at-risk students, some of them say that, or are focused on STEM. So we're using a combination of charter school applications, data, and websites to get at that. We also, in our models, are going to include the size of the charter and location of the charter. So let me focus on the variable that we care most about, which is the racial composition of charter schools. Now, as we started looking at this, we thought, gee, it's important to make sure, in order to interpret our results eventually, that most of our choosers have a whole range of choices with different combinations of racial mix to choose from. So there are some tables. I'm not going to present the whole table here, but the point is, if we look at all the options in the choice sets of the white choosers and the minority choosers, we see very similar distributions, and that's documented in the table. That's the options. Now, if you go down below, you'll see total options, 51,000. The options include a lot of overlapping charter schools. We've got kids here choosing charter schools, kids here. Their options within 20 miles may overlap in lots of ways. So, but the actual choices for the minority switchers is the 2,979. Those actual choices lead us to the conclusion that minorities end up choosing, controlling for all the other things that they might value. Well, no, I haven't controlled yet. Even just descriptively at this point, they choose schools with higher, if they're minorities, with higher minority students. But, you know, this is descriptive here, but we want to put it all together in a full model so that maybe minority students are choosing schools with high proportions of minorities because those schools provide transportation, or maybe they're close or not. So we've now put everything into the full model, and we estimate a conditional logit model, which means the reported coefficients are odds ratios. So a number greater than 1 means the category is valued relative to the base, which is going to be 40 to 60% minority. If it's less than 1, it's disliked relative to the base. And to help you, I've color-coded them, and I'm only going to show you one table with numbers. But green means there's a statistically significant positive preference for that type of school. So here are the revealed preferences related to the racial mix of a charter school students. It's just, this table is just for elementary schools, and it's from the full model. So we're controlling for all the other things that students might value. So let's just go down the first column here. For minority choosers, the red means they're staying away from schools that have low shares, 0 to 20% minority students. But then you go down, all the way down, and you see that they're much more likely to choose charter schools with high proportions of minority students. Then if you go to the white students, you see exactly the reverse pattern, that the whites are much more likely, 1.8 times as likely to choose a charter school with 0 to 20% white students than they are to choose the base, which is a school with 40 to 60%. So it doesn't matter whether we're looking at, well, we look at the all SES students, and then we've divided the sample into low SES students by race and high SES, and there the notice the sample sizes at the bottom of the table are lower because at the elementary school level, we only have data for students in the top 2 in grades 4 and 5. Findings for other charter school characteristics, I'm not going to show you the tables. We have similar tables for all of them. Distance, they prefer both whites and minorities prefer relatively close charter schools. Average performance, both racial groups prefer schools with proficiency rates between 40 and 60%. We don't find, controlling for the other factors that they may value, we don't find a lot of focus on average performance. Lunch services, minority switchers at both the elementary and middle school levels highly value subsidized lunch. White middle school switchers also value having lunch available, even if it's not subsidized. Transportation services, we thought we would find something there, but it was hard to sort those out because of high correlation with the racial mix. I need to move along here. This is my next to last slide. Findings for other characteristics. Charter school missions was interesting. If one of the arguments for charter schools is we have all these creative options for them, we didn't find a lot of emphasis for that. Neither racial group values an innovative philosophy. Both minority and white groups at the elementary level value some sort of innovative curriculum. let me go down to the fourth one there. Minority switchers value schools aimed at disadvantaged students. The white switchers avoid such schools, not surprisingly. White switchers at the middle school level value charters with generic missions over any other type of, or any other charter school with different types of missions. So here are my conclusions. We could go into this in more detail. The racial mix of students in charter schools matters to parents, even when we've controlled for all of these other things. That means there are externalities in this market. If you want to think about charter schools as a market, it means there are big externalities. What the decisions that other people make about charters, about what school to go to, affect yours. The value of specific student compositions differ by race of the chooser, and that's what we put a lot of emphasis on. The result of that will inevitably be racially imbalanced charter schools. Whites prefer one type of racial mix, blacks and minorities prefer another. No clear patterns related to academic achievement. Subsidized lunch is very important for minorities. That could argue for a policy change. Maybe there should be policies requiring all charter schools to provide subsidized lunch. School missions, little interest in innovative philosophy, and that white switchers prefer generic schools. Bottom line, and my time is out, is that there are clear patterns of preferences that lead charter schools to be racially segregated. And that is true for North Carolina. I'd be interested how true it is for a lot of other states. Thanks.